Marine veteran thought his canine died overseas. Collapsed when he found him chained at a junkyard. The service road along the eastern edge of Tulsa runs through a stretch of auto salvage lots and equipment yards that look at 4 in the morning like the edges of a city that has put certain things away and isn't ready to deal with them yet. And Jesse Dahl had driven that road 6 nights a week for 11 months without ever stopping, because there was nowhere to stop and nothing to stop for. And the warehouse shift ended at 3:45, and he was always home before 5. He was driving it on a Wednesday in November when his headlights swept across a chain-link fence at the far end of a salvage yard and caught, for just a second, a shape near a post at the back of the property. A dog, large, chained, sitting in the cold, with the specific stillness of an animal that has learned there is no point in moving, because moving has never changed anything. Jesse drove another 100 feet before his hands brought the truck to a stop, without him deciding to stop. The shape, the size, the way the head was held, not low like a beaten dog, but level, watchful, with a patience that had no bottom. He had seen that posture every day for 2 years. He had last seen it 3 years ago in a field in Helmand Province, looking back at him from 40 meters away, before the world came apart. What Jesse Dahl found when he got out of that truck and walked to that fence in the dark would undo 3 years of a grief he had built his whole life around, and would find, in the wreckage of it, something he had not known he was also looking for. If stories like this one matter to you, stay. Subscribe before we go any further. You'll want to be here when this one lands. Jesse had been a Marine for 6 years and a canine handler for 2 of them, and had been neither for the past 3. And the order of that loss was not accidental. Losing the core had been hard. Losing Axel had been the thing underneath the hard that he did not have words for, and had therefore not used words for, which was the way Jesse Dahl handled most of the things that were true about him. He had grown up in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, the son of a woman who worked dispatch for the county sheriff's office and a man who framed houses and believed that a person's character was visible in the quality of their corners, the way a frame either held square or didn't, and you could tell which one it was going to be from the first day of work. Jesse had enlisted at 22 after 2 years of community college and a persistent sense that he was supposed to be useful in a way that the life he was living wasn't letting him be yet. The Corps had given him the shape he'd been looking for. Canine handler training had given him Axel. Axel was a Belgian Malinois, 4 years old when Jesse was assigned him, with a black muzzle and fawn coat and eyes that were the particular amber brown of old whiskey held up to light. He was not a gentle dog in the way that word usually meant. He was precise, high drive, calibrated to a standard of work that Jesse had spent 6 months learning to meet and another 6 months learning to deserve. What they built together over 2 years of training in one deployment and then a second was not sentiment. It was trust, which is a different and more durable thing. Axel knew Jesse's sleep rhythms, his stress tells, the specific tension in his gait that meant the situation had changed. Jesse knew Axel's working sounds from his resting sounds, his alert posture from his threat posture, the particular way he held his ears when he had found something and was waiting to be told what to do about it. They had operated as a single instrument for 2 years. Jesse had never been as good at anything as he was at being Axel's handler. On the 14th day of their second deployment, a buried IED on a road outside Sangin detonated beneath the vehicle ahead of theirs. Jesse had been in the second vehicle, Axel in the cargo section. The blast threw Jesse against the door hard enough to fracture his shoulder and crack 2 ribs and send him into a concussion that lasted 4 days. When he came back to consciousness in the medevac facility at Bagram, a corpsman told him the dog hadn't made it. Jesse had been sedated heavily through the worst of the acute phase and had asked the question at a moment when the answer, true or not, was delivered with the compressed, careful kindness of people who believed they were being merciful. He had been told Axel was dead. He had believed it. He had been flown to Germany and then to Bethesda and had spent 8 months in physical and occupational therapy and had been medically discharged and had driven back to Oklahoma and had gotten a job at a shipping warehouse and had not gotten another dog because the absence was the last thing he had left of Axel, and he was not ready to fill it with something else. He had been carrying that for 3 years. He walked to the fence. The dog was chained to a post 20 feet inside the property line, the chain long enough that it reached the edge of a corrugated metal lean-to on one side and the fence on the other, and no farther. The yard was dark except for a single security light on a pole near the front gate, and the dog was at the edge of its reach, mostly in shadow, sitting with that level, watchful stillness. Jesse stopped at the fence and stood there for a moment in the cold, his hands at his sides, not calling, not moving. He was looking at the dog's left shoulder. There was a scar there, healed flat and old now, running from the top of the shoulder blade down in a crescent shape. Jesse knew exactly what had made that scar, because he had been 40 meters away when it happened, and had heard the sound it made, and had woken up 4 days later being told it hadn't mattered because the dog was gone. He said the name quietly, the way you say the name of something you're not sure is real. The dog went still in a different way, not the stillness of waiting, the stillness of recognition. He made a sound, low, not quite a whine, not quite a bark, something between them that Jesse had heard exactly once before. On a training day in 29 Palms, when Jesse had gone around a building corner and come back into Axel's sight after 20 minutes out of it, and Axel had made that sound before he could help himself, Jesse sat down on the ground at the fence line. Have you ever lost something and believed for so long that it was gone that you'd built a whole new version of yourself around the absence? And then found it? Tell me in the comments. I don't think Jesse is the only one. I don't think any of us are. The junkyard belonged to a man named Walt Greer, who had been running Greer's Auto Salvage on East Admiral Place for 22 years, and who was, at 4 in the morning on a Wednesday in November, awake in the office at the front of the property because Walt Greer had not been sleeping well for 2 years and had given up pretending he was going to, and had started using the hours between 2 and 5. Do the bookkeeping he couldn't concentrate on during the day. He was 74, had a hip that needed replacing, and was not getting replaced because Walt had decided some time ago that the surgery was more than he wanted to undertake alone, and he was alone. And that settled it. His wife, Margaret, had died 2 years ago in March, which was the same month his son Ray had been killed in Helmand Province, which made March a month Walt was willing to simply get through and not ask anything more of. He had been a quiet man before that March, and he was a quieter one after it, and the junkyard had become the container for his days. The physical work of it, the cataloging, the particular satisfaction of finding the right part for someone who needed it, the reliability of a world where things were broken in ways that could be fixed if you knew what you were doing. He had built the business from a half-acre lot and a truck and a state salvage license into a 2-acre operation with a reputation in the Tulsa auto community for honest pricing and a catalog that Walt maintained by hand in a ledger system he'd been using since 1987 and had no intention of changing. 8 months ago, a man named Devin Harp had started renting the back corner of the property to store vehicles he was moving through a small salvage brokerage. He ran out of a trailer on the other side of Tulsa. Walt had known Devin for years, not well but well enough, and the rental arrangement was modest, and the paperwork was clean, and Walt had agreed to it without much deliberation. Then 4 months ago, Devin had brought the dog. He said he'd gotten it from a guy who couldn't keep it, that it was a good guard dog and would keep the vehicles in the corner safe overnight. The dog was chained when it arrived and had been chained since, and Walt had said more than once that this was not a situation he was comfortable with. And Devin had said the dog was used to it, and Walt had said he wasn't sure a dog could be used to something like that in a way that made it all right. And Devin had looked at him in the way that people look at old men when they have decided the old man's opinion is noted and will not be acted on. Walt had been bringing the dog food and water himself since the 2nd week. He did it before dawn when Devin wasn't around, and he did it without making it a thing, because Walt Greer did not make things into things. He nodded what was wrong, and he did what he could about it, and he carried the rest without announcing it, which was how he had carried most of his life. He had been watching from the office window for 20 minutes when the truck stopped on the service road, and the young man got out and walked to the fence and sat down on the ground in the cold. He watched for another 10 minutes. Then he put on his coat and went out. Jesse was still sitting at the fence when Walt arrived beside him. Axel was lying on his side now, pressed as close to the fence as the chain would allow, with his nose through the chain link and Jesse's hand through the chain link, and the two of them breathing in the same cold air. Walt stood there and looked at this and did not say anything for a while because he understood from the quality of what he was witnessing that saying anything immediately would be the wrong kind of interruption. Then he said, "You know this dog?" Jesse said yes. Walt asked how. Jesse told him. He told it straight and short the way he told every true thing. The deployment, the IED, the 4 days of unconsciousness, the corpsman what he'd been told. He told it looking at Axel, not at Walt, because Axel was the thing he was still making sure was real. Walt was quiet for a long time after Jesse finished. Then he said there was coffee in the office, if Jesse wanted it, and that they should probably talk about what came next. Jesse ran the microchip that morning from Walt's office computer through the National Military Working Dog Registry database, which was publicly accessible for exactly this kind of situation. And the registry returned the chip number against a record that had Jesse's name and service number and unit designation and the word active, meaning the chip had never been formally transferred out of Jesse's name. The dog had moved through at least 3 transactions since the initial misassignment, but the chip had never been updated, which meant the legal ownership trail led back to Jesse Dahl, USMC. Walt said he would call Devin that morning and tell him what they'd found. Devin arrived at 11 o'clock with a folder of papers that contained, among other things, a bill of sale from a man in Joplin for $250 and a county animal registration in Devin's name that was 8 months old. He said the chip registration was probably an error. He said he'd paid for the dog, and he had the paperwork to prove it, and that he'd be taking the dog with him when he left. He said this in the kitchen of Walt's office building, where Walt and Jesse were sitting at the table, and where at Jesse's feet under the table, Axel was lying with his head on Jesse's boot, in the particular boneless way of a dog that has finally been allowed to stop being on guard. Devin looked at the dog. He looked at Jesse. He said the dog didn't know this man, that the dog was just doing what dogs did. Axel raised his head. He stood up, and the sound that came from him was not the working dog growl of a threat assessment. It was something more specific and more personal, a low continuous signal directed entirely at Devin, and he moved to a position between Jesse's chair and where Devin was standing in the kitchen doorway, and he did not move from it. His eyes were on Devin's hands. When Devin took one step forward toward the table, Axel's weight shifted forward onto his front legs and his lips came back, and Devin stopped. Then Walt said it. He said it quietly, not to Devin, just to the room, in the voice of a man who had been watching something for 4 months without saying it to anyone. He cried the first 3 nights. Nobody spoke. Devin looked at the dog. He looked at Jesse, who had not moved and was not going to move, who was sitting in the particular stillness of a man who has been trained to let the situation do the work. Jesse had the chip registry printout on the table in front of him. He had a number for a military working dog legal advocate in Virginia that Walt's pastor had found that morning in 20 minutes on his phone. He had 3 years of formally documented handler-dog pairing records that were part of his service file and accessible with a request he had already submitted at 7 a.m. He did not raise his voice. He said that he was not interested in making this a thing that was harder for anyone than it needed to be. He said that the bill of sale from Joplin was a bill of sale for a dog whose legal ownership had never formally transferred away from Jesse Dahl, which made every transaction in the chain after the original misassignment legally questionable, which was a conversation Devin could have with an attorney if he wanted to. He said the simplest version of this was that Devin took his $250 as a loss, which was unfortunate, and walked away from a situation that was going to cost him significantly more than $250 if he chose not to. Axel had not moved from his position. He watched Devin the entire time. When Devin picked up his folder and left, Axel tracked him to the door and stood there until the sound of Devin's truck had faded down the service road. Then he turned and came back to Jesse and put his head on Jesse's knee and stayed there. Walt watched this. He turned to look out the kitchen window at the salvage yard, at the rows of vehicles in the pale November light, and he was quiet for a while in the way he was quiet when something was working its way through him. Then he asked Jesse where he had served. Jesse told him, Helmand Province, 2019 and 2020. 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. Walt did not look at him for a moment. Then he turned from the window and reached across the table and moved a coffee mug, and under it was a photograph that had been on the table since Walt had put it there that morning. After Jesse had told him where he'd served, a young man in Marine dress uniform, mid-20s, with Walt's jaw and eyes that were lighter than Walt's, standing in front of a base entrance sign. The unit patch on his shoulder was the same one Jesse had worn. Jesse looked at the photograph for a long time. Walt said his son Ray had deployed with 2nd Battalion in 2019. He said Ray had been killed in March of 2020, 6 months before Jesse was wounded on that same road. Jesse knew the name. He had known the name since Walt said it the first time, but he had not known how to say so. Ray Greer was not a man Jesse had known well. They had been in different companies. But Ray Greer was a name that had been said in Jesse's unit the way the names of the dead were said, with a weight and a care that meant something. He remembered being told. He remembered the specific quality of that particular morning. He told Walt what he remembered. He told it simply and without embellishment, the way true things were worth telling. That Ray had had a reputation across the battalion for being the kind of Marine who solved problems before they became problems, who looked after people without needing to be asked, who was, by every account Jesse had ever heard, a man the battalion was worse off without. Walt listened to this with his hands around his coffee cup and his eyes on the table. When Jesse finished, Walt sat with it for a while. Then he said, "He would have liked that dog." If you were sitting at that table knowing everything you'd just found out, what would you have said to Walt in that moment? I've thought about it. I think most of us would have sat in that kitchen for a long time without saying anything at all. Sometimes that's exactly right. The legal resolution took 11 days. The military working dog legal advocate in Virginia, a retired JAG officer named Colonel Patricia Hughes, who had handled dozens of cases like this. 1. Confirmed within 48 hours that the original misassignment had created a defective chain of title and that Jesse's handler registration was the controlling document. Devin Harp did not contest it. Walt suspected that Devin had done enough research in those 48 hours to understand that contesting it was not in his interest, and that the story of a dog believed dead for 3 years found chained in a junkyard was not a story Devin wanted told in a Tulsa courtroom. Axel came home with Jesse on a Friday. Walt's pastor, a man named Reverend Tomas Birch, who ran the small Baptist congregation that Walt had been attending with a regular faith for 15 years and with more regular faith since Margaret died, had organized a small gathering at Walt's place that Saturday morning. Not a celebration, just people who wanted to be present for something good. 7 people came. One of them brought biscuits. One of them brought a dog bed that was nicer than anything Jesse had owned. Reverend Birch said a few words that were not a sermon, just a quiet naming of what had happened, which was that something lost had been found and that this was worth standing still for a moment and acknowledging. Walt stood on his porch in the November cold and watched Jesse in the yard with Axel, watched the dog run the length of the yard and come back to Jesse's feet and run it again. The joy of it, clean and unguarded in the way that only a dog's joy is, without any of the self-consciousness that people bring to their own relief. Walt had not felt anything that could be called simple happiness since March of 2 years ago. He felt it now. It was not the same as what he'd had before. It was something smaller and more specific, and in the way of things that arrive late, more clearly understood. There are moments that feel less like luck and more like a long corruption, as if something that went wrong in one place has been very slowly in another place set right. Jesse Dahl had been carrying a grief built on a story that wasn't true. The dog had not died. The dog had survived the same blast that put Jesse in a medevac and had been alive every day of the 3 years Jesse had been living around the absence of him. Jesse did not know, in those 11 months of night shifts and empty apartment, that 2 miles away on a service road, on a property owned by a man whose son he had served alongside, the thing he was mourning was waiting. He had been waiting at the wrong grave. This story is for every veteran who was told something that turned out not to be the whole truth and who carried the weight of it alone for longer than they should have had to. And for every dog that kept faith when it had no way of knowing whether faith would ever be answered. Is there someone in your life who found something they'd given up on? A person? A connection? A piece of themselves they thought was gone? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every one. This section deserves those stories. Every story on this channel is about choosing not to look away, and sometimes choosing to stop the truck. If that means something to you, subscribe. There are more stories to tell, and you'll want to be here for them. Which moment in this story will stay with you? I'll see you in the comments.